Hello, everybody. A few days ago, we did a show with my old friend Gary Marcus, an AI expert, the author of How We Can Ensure That AI Works for Us. We've done so many shows on AI. It seems as if it's taken for granted that it will dominate the next few technological decades. But there's another story also brewing, the story of quantum computing, which we've done fewer shows on. It's less glitzy, less self-evident, but perhaps in some ways equally, if not more important in terms of the future of America and the future of the world. My guest today, Martin Schmidt, is the president of Rensselaer Polytechnic University, America's oldest and one of its most distinguished universities, focusing on technology. And Rensselaer has just announced a partnership with IBM to unveil the world's first IBM Quantum System 1 on a university campus at Rensselaer, of course. Martin Schmidt, who is the president, is joining us today. Congratulations, Martin, on this coup, is it? I mean, how did you convince IBM to do this?
Well, RPI and IBM go way back, a long-standing relationship. My board chair had previously been the head of IBM Research, and the current head of IBM Research I knew when he was a graduate student at MIT, and I was on the faculty. So we have a lot of personal connections, and we're successful in convincing them to place one of the computers on the RPI campus as the first university in the world to actually have one on our campus.
Well, congratulations on that. I think you were at MIT for 41 years. You know your technology. A lot of again, you know this better than I do. There's a lot of talk of quantum, some of it hype, some of it skeptical. For our audience, which might be technically relatively literate, but not as sophisticated as you, how would you explain quantum computing? What exactly is it, Martin?
Yeah, well, it's and that's part of the challenge and part of the reason why we wanted to have a quantum computer is it's not easy to understand how quantum computer runs um, and how you would use it. I'd say the simplest way to describe it is that at a fundamental level, many things in our physical world operate because of quantum mechanics. And so when you think about how molecules and atoms interact with each other, a lot of those interactions are fundamentally quantum mechanical in nature. But they're extraordinarily complex to understand and to model using classic computers. But by having a computer that operates under the principles of quantum mechanics, you actually can model things that are fundamentally quantum mechanical in nature. And I think the easiest way to explain it is that while quantum mechanical things are very difficult to simulate in a classic computer, by moving to a quantum computer, we can actually start to solve these problems more simply.
Is there something almost surreal about some of the principles underlining not just quantum computing, but quantum technology, that it radically undermines how we think, for example, about time?
Yeah, exactly. And the theories of quantum mechanical theory is quite challenging for people to wrap their head around. And I think one of the reasons why we were keen to get the quantum computer is we feel it's really important for us to start trying to understand what are these quantum computers going to be really good for? What kind of problems are they particularly well suited to solve? But also more importantly, perhaps, you can't expect someone in the future that's going to program a quantum computer to have to understand things like entanglement and coherence and various principles in quantum mechanical theory. And so that means you have to develop abstractions. And that's something that, educators, universities are good at doing. It's the same as, today you don't need to understand how a transistor operates in order to program a silicon-based classic computer. And so we need to get to a place where everyone can effectively utilize quantum computing without having to have a deep understanding of quantum mechanics.
It's interesting that IBM, of course, have been around for more than a century. I think they were founded in New York. I know you have a close relationship with them, both at RPI and probably personally. But isn't it also important to note, Martin, that quantum computers aren't just bigger versions or more powerful versions of what we take for granted are computers today. The original IBM computers fitted into a room, for example, and their physical size was always the, the lead feature in all stories about these new computers after the Second World War. What exactly physically does this new IBM quantum computer look like on your campus? Is it in a big room? Does it require a lot of heat or cooling?
It's a great question, by the way, but it's actually quite small compared to we have one of the fastest supercomputers on our campus in any private university in the country, and that supercomputer is what you classically would think of. It's in a big room, it has a lot of cooling and electrical power. The quantum computer actually that we've installed on the campus is a 10-foot by 10-foot box basically, and then another set of infrastructure that sits beneath that on a lower floor. So dimensionally, it's actually much smaller than our high performance computer, and consequently, it doesn't draw as much power and things like that.
Why then is it such a big deal? It's this small thing. Why can't all universities have them? I mean, how much? And I excuse the rather vulgar question here, but how much did it cost IBM to actually produce one of these things?
Well, if you get an IBM Quantum System 1, it's typically tens of millions of dollars per year to have it. So it's a not inexpensive venture to get one of these quantum computers. But they're new. There's a lot of proprietary um, uh, content within the quantum computer itself. So I think they're understandably anxious to make sure that they don't, distribute them to a lot of places where somebody might get under the hood, if you will, and understand how IBM makes their quantum computer. So we operate with a certain amount of control over access to the computer to respect that concern about the proprietary nature.
Your life's been in the tech industry one way or the other as a teacher, a researcher, Martin. IBM, maybe I'm being slightly unfair, but I think there's some truth to this. IBM have missed the bus. They missed the bus on personal computing. It was Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, who stole their so-called personal computer and made it popular. They certainly missed the bus on the internet. And in some sense, they're more of a relic, a historical curiosity as a big tech company than a Microsoft or a Google today. Do you think that IBM, I know you're not speaking on their behalf, but are they concerned and have they learned from the past in terms of making sure that they don't miss the bus on quantum?
Well, I would say that their investment in AI that led to Watson, was a big forward
And I missed
investment by the
that. Well,
research.
it was, but again, it's open AI now. That's a private company that's worth $150 billion company. It wasn't IBM who got to the LLMs. It was open AI and Google.
In generative AI, no question. But I think that they're right there now, and I think their customers are much more businesses than individuals. So you don't often think about who are they serving, but that their business is really about supporting other businesses. And then I think with quantum, they've made remarkable progress. And what's interesting to me personally about IBM is that their steadfast commitment to the research center. When you think of all the various research laboratories that used to exist, Bell Labs associated with Bell Corporation, RCA Labs, IBM's labs are one of the last really serious corporate research labs.
Okay, Martin, we've been circling this, and I know it's a tricky one, but what ideally, I mean, you're not a science fiction writer, but there is a science fictional quality to quantum. We've made it clear, you've underlined the fact that quantum computers and quantum computing isn't just a faster version of traditional computing. It actually represents a profound shift. What kinds of things in the 21st century will quantum computing be able to do that traditional computing can't?
Yeah. So I think maybe the best example, and the one where you're likely to see some of the first uptake of the technology, is in sort of in the area of materials synthesis, materials discovery. And the way I think about it, that that has been evolving with every new generation of computing technology. But certainly, if you go back to the 50s or 60s, materials discovery was very Edisonian, meaning, you might have someone who had a deep understanding of decades and decades of literature in a particular material, and maybe you're trying to make that material stronger or more resistant to corrosion or something like that. And so you go in the laboratory and you synthesize different versions of that material with different additives and test it. And what you relied on was that one individual who had a deep knowledge and memory of everything that had been published about that material. Obviously, with the development of advanced computing, online search, and then ultimately machine learning, it's made you less reliant on that deep understanding of the literature in order to get close to what you want before you go into the lab and synthesize it. And then the other interesting thing that happened is that the lab has actually gone on the cloud, where you can submit jobs to have materials synthesized in remote laboratories and then have the material sent to you. So there's been a high degree of automation and a lot of use of advanced computation to understand materials. What quantum allows us to do is to actually model what might happen when those atoms interact inside the material, and how would that translate into a particular property that you desire. And so you get considerably closer to the point of being able to design a material to a specific material property, and to do it all on the quantum computer, augmented by classic computers, and we could talk about that. And then go into the lab once to synthesize the material. And that's a radical step forward in material science.
But how does
and
that,
drug discovery, for that matter.
I mean, it sounds interesting, but has it changed the world? Those huge IBM computers, which existed in refrigerated rooms, now we carry around in our pockets. Is it conceivable, Martin, that in 50 or 75 years, we'll all be walking around with quantum computers, maybe not in our pockets, but embedded in our heads or our hands?
Well, what I would say
and
is,
maybe it's the wrong way of thinking of it.
Yeah, it may be, but what I would say is, and people represent this different ways, but if you think of classic high performance computers being comprised of CPUs, and now today, we have for generative AI the use of GPUs. Think of quantum computer as a QPU, and I think what everybody's moving towards is the notion that what you would love to be in a position of is you pose a problem to a computer that's comprised of CPUs, GPUs, and QPUs, and that computer figures out which parts of the problem are best solved with a CPU, a GPU, or a QPU. So I think the holy grail, if you will, is a computer that comprises each of those types of processing units.
What does quantum mean for Moore's law in terms of this law that was put together by Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of IBM, which is the foundation, the operating system of the world today? Does quantum compound Moore's law? Does it represent a new kind of world of computing where the power of chips is redundant and we have to think of things differently?
Well, yeah, I think it's, really Moore's law was about how you scaled silicon devices in order to get more transistors per unit area of a wafer, and then the economic value associated with that. We've found that over the past decade or so, very challenging to follow Moore's law. In fact, I don't think people necessarily think of it that way anymore, because you hit some headwinds, particularly
Right, and there is in physics, in terms of physics, there is a physical wall that some people at least argue Moore's law will eventually crash into. That at a certain point, you're just not going to be able to physically produce a chip which doubles in size because it's just physically impossible.
Yeah, and so what's happening is the architecture and the materials are being changed to continue to squeeze performance out of the transistor, but it may be that the transistor itself is changing shape and being reduced in size in that way. So there's a lot going on there that it sort of departs from Moore's law as a classic, what they call Dennard scaling. But I think the point about quantum is when you go from 1 bit to 2 bit to 4 bit, you double the performance of the computer. So when we went from 16-bit to 32-bit processors, you get effectively a doubling of the processing power. With qubits, there's an exponential growth that occurs with the addition of qubits. So what's interesting in many ways about quantum computers is that you don't have to go from, if you go from 10 qubits to 100 qubits, you get this exponential growth in computing power versus the sort of linear growth that you would have gotten from a classic computer. So I think when you think about scaling with a quantum computer, it's more that exponential growth.
Where are we, Martin, in the narrative of quantum? I mean, you don't know, of course, for sure. Nobody knows, but people often talk about these things in terms of baseball and innings. We certainly haven't even arrived at the field yet, have we, when it comes to the history of quantum?
So the term, everybody has slightly different terminology, but what I would say is the aspiration is to get to what people would call quantum supremacy, where you can solve problems with a quantum computer that you'll never in your lifetime be able to solve with a classic computer. Right now, a lot of people would argue that we're at the level of what's called quantum utility. And what they mean by that is today, if you wanted to run a program on a quantum computer, you can build a simulator that runs on a classic computer, but that operates as if it was a quantum computer, and you could run algorithms on that simulator. Today, we're at the point where the quantum computers that are being produced, and the System 1 that we have on our campus, achieves quantum utility, which means that it can run algorithms as fast or faster than a classic computer. So you're at the point now where you can actually run programs on a quantum computer and not have to rely on a simulator on a classic computer. And so that's an important first step, because we're now in the quantum realm and getting real understanding of how those quantum computers operate. And then the goal, of course, is to get to quantum supremacy. Everyone has arguments about when that'll be. Some would say it'll be in 3 years. Some would say it'll be 5 years. Some don't believe it'll ever achieve. So that's a great deal of speculation, I would say, that people have.
Is it a similar uncertainty to the one surrounding AGI? Some people believe it's impossible. Some people believe it's imminent. Others simply argue that it will happen in the distant future. What's your take on the future of quantum?
Yeah, my view is that I'm in the camp of believing that we're going to be seeing quantum supremacy in 4 to 6 years. I think there's enough progress, particularly in the last several years, that have been made, especially in mitigating some of the errors that people encounter with a quantum computer. So I think some of the predictions and some of the suggestions that we'll never get there were based on having to get a perfect quantum computer. And more recently, some work has been done to really help understand how you can take a quantum computer that has a certain level of error and mitigate those errors. And it's interestingly enough, it's often done by pairing the quantum computer up with a classic computer.
So if we get to quantum supremacy in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, give me one concrete real-world area where this quantum supremacy can actually change the nature of things. Might it be, for example, in figuring out cures to cancer?
Absolutely, because I think, when you talk about drug discovery, again, these molecules all operate based on quantum mechanical principles. So the example I gave earlier, with the ability to calculate exactly how a material is going to behave or a molecule is going to function before you go out and synthesize it, I think is a breakthrough.
What other areas? How will it intersect with AI?
Well, I think they'll be complementary. So I think you're gonna see the quantum classic computer right next to the quantum computer, each of them solving parts of the problem that they're best suited for. You can't store data in a quantum computer. So, when you think about large language models and how you train them, that's, those are going to be good for that purpose, but not for what the quantum computer will do.
As you know, Martin, there's lots of fear and nervousness about these big new AI companies. Gary Marcus has a book about how we can ensure that AI works for us. Is this going to be the case with quantum? Every new wave of technology, from the personal computer to the internet to Web 2 to AI, seems to have gone with the appearance of larger and larger, perhaps more monopolistic tech companies, more powerful companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Should we be fearful of a company that, maybe not a company like IBM, but a new company that will achieve what you call quantum supremacy? Is this something? I mean, I understand that it will could theoretically benefit society, but is it also going to be the kind of technology that will make these companies even more powerful financially, economically, and perhaps politically?
Well, that's a good question. I would say, probably the biggest fear with respect to quantum computing is its capacity to break the RSS encryption. And so what happens when you have that moment where you can now de-encrypt all this information that's out there that's encrypted through RSS? So that's certainly one concern. And people are developing better encryption algorithms that are quantum resilient, I guess I would say, or quantum resistant. So I think that when people worry about the negative effects potentially of a quantum computer achieving quantum supremacy, oftentimes the first thing you think about is what it's going to mean to all that encryption. Um, but with respect to, is one company going to dominate? It's hard for me to see that because I think it's a piece of hardware as opposed to anything else. And I think there are a number of companies that are competing to sell quantum computers today. And so I think right now you have a bit of a competitive landscape.
I mean, billions of dollars are being poured, perhaps fewer billions than into AI, but billions of dollars are being poured into quantum, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but I wouldn't be
I'm sure
surprised if it
nobody
was
knows the
billions.
exact number, but certainly, I mean, even the big tech companies like Google and Microsoft have their own quantum
Yeah,
initiatives.
right, right.
Well, it's all speculative, but interesting. Well, let's come back down to earth, to the White House's Chips and Science Act. I know that also at RPI, you're working on the chips front, particularly with Micron computers, and you've been involved in their initiative to set up a new uh, memory manufacturing center. Tell us about what's happening on that front, your relationship with Micron, and how that's changing, not the future, but the current nature of America, technology, and RPI.
Yeah. Well, I'd start by saying that, interestingly enough, RPI was probably one of the first universities to have a microelectronics research and curriculum activity in the early '60s, shortly after the discovery of the silicon semiconductors and transistors. So it's been a large part of our legacy is working in this space. The Chips and Science Act, the $52 billion, which is targeted to basically reshore semiconductor manufacturing in the US. The reason why Micron is committing to building a capacity in upstate New York is really because of the existence of what's called Albany Nanotech. Albany Nanotech is a a roughly $15 billion facility about 6 miles from the Rensselaer campus. And it's basically where they have all the equipment you need to develop state-of-the-art semiconductors. And as you may know, the development of a next generation chip technology is an incredibly expensive undertaking and requires this kind of $15 billion facility. And we have it here in the capital region. And so companies like Global Foundries, IBM, Micron, Applied Materials, they all have significant presence in adjacent to the Albany Nanotech so that they can rely on that facility to develop their next generation Micron memory technology or so on. So we're working with Micron, we're working with IBM, we're working with Global Foundries, a lot Applied Materials, and really on multiple fronts, some in research, like thinking about what are some of the new materials that'll be brought into mainstream semiconductors to advance the technology. Some of it in the area of workforce development. It's one thing to say you're going to build all these new factories, but then you also have to fill them up with people that know how to operate them. And I think the numbers I've heard from Micron is when they fully realize their goals in upstate New York, it's going to amount to, I think, 9,000 jobs. And it's an interesting challenge because as you know, and this is coming from somebody who, when I left RPI to go to MIT for my PhD, I began my research in semiconductors. And so I've been in the semiconductor industry as a researcher for a long time. But as the industry started moving offshore in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, the universities stopped hiring faculty that worked in mainstream silicon technology because the jobs for the PhD students weren't there. And so it's an interesting conundrum in that in order to help Micron and everyone else get those 9,000 employees, the universities have to have their own workforce development challenge, which is bringing more talent in to do the research and to do the teaching. And so one of the things that we're benefiting from is while semiconductors did largely move offshore, with the exception of places like Intel in Portland and some places in Arizona and Texas, in this region, they've stayed, so you've got IBM and Global Foundries. And so we have a number of PhD scientists and engineers who've spent 30 or 40 years in the industry, and we've been bringing them to the campus to help us restock and develop the modern training that we need for this workforce.
Why is this a story, not just this story, but other stories like this that we don't know about? You're the president of RPI rather than the American president. I'm sure, like the rest of us, Martin, you've been following the presidential election, lots of talk of people in Ohio eating pets and other weird stories. These sorts of stories aren't heard. What's your sense? I mean, you're not a political appointment, so I'm not necessarily trying to find out whether you'd vote for Biden or Trump, but there are a lot of announcements from the Biden administration. A lot of money was poured into the Chips and Science Act. There's not a lot. It's not self-evident what's that's achieved. Is in your sense, have these investments of the Biden administration been in some ways foundational for a new wave of innovation in America?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's just start with the investments. So largely the money is going to basically support the companies to build the facilities in the U.S. And including companies like TSMC to build in the U.S. That is obviously going to help us, and we won't find ourselves necessarily in the situation we were in during the COVID era when Ford couldn't ship F-150s for lack of a fairly basic computer chip. So having a domestic supply base for computer chips, but also having partnerships. For example, Rapidus is a company that just got created in Japan. They today have about 200 engineers in Albany learning 2 nanometer technology so that they can build it in their factory in Hokkaido. So I think the first step obviously is catalyzing the creation of these new facilities in the United States and elsewhere with friendly nations. And and what we're trying to do is really just get ahead of it in terms of making sure that we're producing the workforce that those fabs are going to need. And so I think, time will tell how successful it's going to be, but the fabs are getting built, and I think the portfolio of investments, beyond the actually just getting the fabs, but also making sure that we're supporting some of the research that will lead to the next generation of chip technology. I think overall it's a bold commitment, but I think it's sized appropriately for the goal.
You conveniently dodged the political question, quite understandably. At RPI, in part of your marketing material and bringing new students in, you talk about come change the world with us. It's not come change America. I'm guessing that at RPI, you have a lot of Chinese students, maybe quite a lot of relationships with Chinese technologists, Chinese tech companies, maybe even the Chinese government. What's your sense when it comes to these big technological issues of this growing economic nationalism in America, this notion of the world being an economic zero-sum game, and if China wins, America loses, and vice versa?
Yeah, well, first of all, just a little bit of clarity. There's not a lot of Chinese folks up here in Rensselaer. And we tend to be more focused on the domestic group. But I do think that it's really about securing access to the chips, and obviously there's nervousness about Taiwan, and if China decides to get more aggressive with Taiwan, when you consider how many companies rely singularly on TSMC that are based in the US, those are reasonable concerns to have. And so I think, I don't know that it's about the US beating China in having the best chips, but it's certainly about the US being able to produce chips that it needs.
Later this year, Martin, again, you don't need me to tell you this, on November 5th of this year, RPI will be celebrating its 200th anniversary. I think you're the oldest technical polytechnic university in America, even older than MIT. You're the president of the university. You worked a lot with MIT. MIT has actually been in the news because of all the demonstrations about Gaza. The universities have been on the front page for reasons that probably keep presidents like yourself up late. Are you concerned about the future of university education in America? You're a technical university. I'm sure it's much less political at RPI than other universities, but we've done a number of shows on this. I even went to a new university in Austin to talk about what they think of as a post-woke education. Is there a need for American educators and institutions like RPI to be reinventing themselves in the 21st century too?
Yeah, I would say the short answer to your question is yes. And when you think about all the challenges that we face, the declining public perception of higher ed, the sense that that maybe a four-year college degree isn't the path to prosperity, concerns about the activism on campus, concerns about the rising cost of the education. I mean, all these are legitimate issues that, as a university leader, you have to really think about what is our individual institution's response to that. And I say it that way because I think you have to also realize that higher ed is a very heterogeneous industry. You have large public institutions, you have well-endowed private institutions, you have more tuition-dependent private institutions. And I used to be setting the budget for a very large, well-endowed private institution, and now I'm at a much more tuition-dependent private institution. And I can tell you, it's almost fundamentally a different business in terms of how you have to operate. And so we certainly, and particularly in this 200th year, are spending time thinking about what is our strategic plan for the future and how are we going to respond to these challenges.
Finally, Martin, being very generous with your time. I know you're a big fan of a book co-authored by Jonathan Gruber, Simon Johnson, both MIT people. Johnson's been on the show before. Jump-starting America, how breakthrough science can revive economic growth and the American dream. What's your take as the president of RPI, a man who's interested in quantum and the future of technology, as well as the current state of chips? What is the role of places like RPI and technology in jump-starting America? It seems in some ways, the more high-tech America becomes in certain areas, perhaps Cambridge, Massachusetts, Silicon Valley, the less high-tech, the more almost feudal other parts of America can become. Can America be jump-started broadly, or is it always going to be in pockets of innovation?
Yeah. So this is a kind of a passion for me, and in fact, you know, my interest in returning to RPI was really fueled by the sense that as a nation, we can't just survive, and this is really the thesis of Simon and John's book. We can't survive on a set of superstar cities, and you could pick them: Boston, New York, LA, San Francisco. We need more metropolitan areas in this nation to step forward economically. And so then the question is, well, how? And that's some of what Simon and John talk about in their book. But there's also studies that have been done recently to try and understand what is it that allows certain metropolitan areas to thrive economically while others not so much. And having seen the transformation of Kendall Square in the 41 years I was there, where you went from when I arrived there as a graduate student, Kendall Square was 7 parking lots, a couple of abandoned factories, and a diner. Today, it's
What
the
year was
greatest
that?
biotech cluster. 1981.
Yeah,
Today's
I mentioned before, I came to live in Central Square, just up the road from in Cambridge, just up the road from Kendall, in the early 90s. And I've never been to a place which looks more different today than it did over the last 30, 35 years.
Exactly. But there's other examples. You can look at Pittsburgh, which, in the 70s and 80s is a Rust Belt city, and has gone through a pretty significant transformation. And so we've looked at that. We tried to understand what is it that allows certain regions to grow like that. And an interesting PhD work done by a guy named Ben Armstrong at MIT compared Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And what Ben learned was obviously, one, that Pittsburgh has done much better economically over the past 40 years than Cleveland, even though they were both ostensibly Rust Belt cities back in the day. What you find is that in Pittsburgh, the economic development plan that was submitted to the governor of Pennsylvania in I think it was 85, was co-authored by the presidents of Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh Medical. And the punchline, and this is also in John and Simon's book, is that if you can find institutions that are deeply committed to a region and have the capacity to think long term, if they work together in a strategic way, that's what happens. That's how things transform. So what happened in Kendall Square? Well, MIT made a bold bet by pivoting its biology department towards molecular biology in the late 60s or early 60s to late 60s. Actively encouraged companies to move to the region, partnered with Harvard and the research hospitals to create entities like the Broad Institute, and then worked with the governor's office to create a biotech investment fund in Deval Patrick's case, it was $1 billion program, $100 million a year spent to support the growth of that industry. So this is those institutions deeply committed to the region working together. Same thing happened in Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon, Pitt working together. People classically refer to it as EDS and MEDS. So we know what the playbook is. We know what it takes to transform regions. Challenge is it takes about 40 years because that's the time it took to get Kendall Square. That's the time it took to turn Pittsburgh around and become a robotics and other type of technological hub. And interestingly enough, I mentioned earlier Albany Nanotech, which is bringing all that semiconductor activity to the region. Well, that actually has its origins back in the 80s. As a graduate student studying semiconductors, I recalled seeing ads in the trade magazines for the semiconductor industry that New York would run saying, we have shovel-ready sites in upstate New York for your fab. And so they've had this 40-year commitment to strengthening semiconductors in this region. So to me, that knowing that that's what you have to do, Rensselaer is an institution that has the capacity to think long term, is deeply committed to this region, and so we're spending our time finding partners to see where we can create unfair advantages for the region, whether it's in semiconductors, whether it's in quantum computing.
And what becomes then of, because they're always going to be losers, Martin, a Cleveland, a West Virginia, places in the old economy, maybe even one day Silicon Valley. Are there always, in your view, even in a jump-started America, are there always going to be have-nots, especially in this increasingly high-tech America?
Well, that's a good question. I'm a eternal optimist, so I'd like to think that every region, if they can get their act together, has the potential to see growth. And I mean, look, while the biotech cluster in Kendall Square is going to be very difficult to reproduce just because of the density of talent, advanced scientific talent. However, it's become very difficult to manufacture, to do biomanufacturing in Massachusetts, in the greater Boston area, because of the cost of living, transportation, cost of construction. So that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity for another region to step forward and say, hey, we want to be a biomanufacturing hub, and capture that piece of the economic puzzle.
Well, Martin Schmidt, the president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI in short. It's nice to have some optimism in an America which seems to be dominated by pessimism. Thank you so much. We have to get you back on the show, Martin, in the not too distant future when maybe when quantum supremacy is a little closer. Thank you so much.